Thank you. All right. I think the camera is going to capture me in profile, and so everyone remember the camera always puts on 10 kilos. Okay. Volker, please give me a 5 when we reach 30 minutes to make sure that I start winding up a little bit, because you know me, I talk too much. For everybody's benefit, I am a lawyer, but this is mainly a policy talk. Yeah, and let's get going. It's a beautiful day in Berlin, and it's beautiful to be here. We've had wonderful Middle Korean food, and so we are ready for this. So first of all, I want to acknowledge country. We always do this in Australia. People will be speaking to me from various parts of the world, I'm sure, but certainly in Australia we talk about the fact that the lands that we're standing on are typically the unceded lands of the Aboriginal people. This is of course a picture of Sydney. I'm actually Melbourne based at Monash, but I think it's important to think about history, which is what we'll do through the talk anyway. It's fabulous photos. That's the Aboriginal flag flying high over the Sydney Opera House. Okay. Oh. Good. Okay, so apologies for the photo, but it's worth putting in context where we are. 2026, as Volker said, we were here almost 5 years ago at the previous Plamadiso talk. It has been a decade of, we often actually foreshorten the period. We've had a decade of Trump. We've had a decade of Elon going bad. We've had a decade of increasing hype, but also increasing progress in AI in various different ways. And of course, last week we had, or rather a week on Friday rather, we had the SpaceX debut on the stock market, and we had this apparition appearing in Times Square by some people wanting to point out some of the things that are wrapped into the SpaceX exploration. 10 years ago, 2016, it was the Dilbert cartoon of telling Wally he wanted him to sign up for an AI project with no resources and no possibility of success. And Wally says, I'm completely useless, I won't let you down. We have hopefully moved on a bit in the last 10 years, but I'm going to suggest that we have not moved on quite as far as we would like to have done. Okay, and it's worth saying that, of course, we are now conscious of some of the issues with not just the public goods that arrive with AI, but some of the public bads as well, including AI slop dominating internet content, particularly, for instance, misinformation. It's actually the decade of having had fake news as the word of the year for 2016, which was, of course, fake in itself, because fake news was 2 words. But nevertheless. And what we don't need, of course, is more content coming from sovereign EU, which would be EU slop content, so we need to be worried about this. But we are very conscious this week. The G7 summit just took place over the last couple of days. The G7 leaders were, of course, in Versailles, where President Macron, using his wicked sense of humor, persuaded President Trump to sign a peace deal at the Palace of Versailles. But also there was lots of discussion about the potential for an American AI kill switch, particularly because, of course, the lack of access to anthropic fable and to mythos. And so we're all very conscious of this particularly delicate period of time we're in, and the intertwining of international relations and AI development in ways that we could have predicted 5 years ago, but we would not perhaps have expected to reach quite such a head quite so soon. And I'm also conscious, in the background, of course, we have various issues like unfortunately, the terrible event at the school in southern Iran, which apparently seemingly was targeted by AI, and then, of course, led to a lot of innocents dying. A lot of people have died one way or another in the last 4 months. Okay, so what am I going to talk about here? I'm going to talk about sovereignty, but I'm not an international lawyer, so I'm going to give you obviously I'm a regulatory lawyer, for those of you who know my work. I'm going to talk about sovereignty in terms of AI. So sovereignty traditionally means power over the authority to govern within the borders of a nation state. And that's more or less a concept from the Treaty of Westphalia. It's a concept which is about 300 years old. It was never, to be honest, a hugely rock-solid concept in international law. Lots of leeching of borders. The period since then has been the period where you see on the right this wonderful map of the most important public holiday in the world, which is, of course, the holiday of independence from Britain, which pretty much every country in the world has. It doesn't actually have there, but also we could have maybe a reverse holiday for Hanover, Hanover, of course, took over Great Britain at that period, at the beginning of the Treaty of Westphalia period. But nevertheless, we have this traditional notion. It doesn't really work very well in the world of digital networks and of digital trade. We live in a world, this is my more generalist slide, of shared sovereignty. The United Nations, pretty much every country in the world signed up to the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. We tend to think of that in terms of Article 19 when we talk about communications networks, freedom to receive and impart information. We have a European Union, which has 27 and soon more member states, despite Brexit, which was a strange kind of demented British idea of somehow rejecting our world of shared sovereignty, as if we could turn the clock back to, I don't know, depends which Brexit Britain you talk to, 1855 or something, I don't know, when the British invaded Crimea. Anyway, that's a little far in the rear mirror. We have NATO, we have, of course, the G7 that just met. We have these financial instruments and financial institutes which have kept the world relatively stable for 80 years. I know you can go to talks where you talk about the breakdown in those networks as well. We have the standards organizations that all of us working in AI are very familiar with, not just public, but also private standards organizations, many of them that are bottom-up rather than top-down. We also have, and everyone will remember from the Snowden revelations, Five Eyes intelligence network, actually sort of 5+, because Singapore is a kind of, not just an honorary member, but a very real member. Some of you know that's because of telegraph and then internet cable routing. And ask me a question about global crossing and we can talk about that. And also Israel to some extent as well, although who knows where we are today with intelligence sharing given the US-Israeli relationship. And we have this very robust, very well-known, relatively new alliance between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, which has as one of its pillars nuclear submarines that may never appear. Because I don't mean they disappear because they're underwater, I mean they disappear because they haven't been built, and there's not much chance of them being built very quickly. And Pillar 2 of that AUKUS treaty is actually about advanced weaponry, including drone weaponry, but also including AI-generated weaponry, AI-generated intelligence on the battlefield. So it is more than just giant nuclear subs. It's actually also about AI progress and cooperation. And we'll come back to that a little bit, I think, at the end. So I'll talk about Australia and the UK towards the end, talk about the UK right at the end because it's quite a momentous day in the UK. AI sovereignty. It's been put forward by not just Ranjit Singh but by various other people as the capacity to exercise agency in working with algorithmic systems. So it's not just having a data center in your country because that data center could be owned by a company which routes the data out of the country, which tends to take its algorithmic R&D outside the country, which does other things. It may also mean that countries can't really pass effective AI laws because the companies it's trying to influence have got all of their important functions taking place outside the country. Some of you who are familiar with internet governance are familiar with these ideas about where the strategic decisions being made by multinational companies. And so the summary of that is, without the power to shape or to have an ability for a government to exit from its dependencies, sovereignty risks becoming symbolic when it comes to AI. You are reliant upon foreign companies, even if they're based inside your borders. And I would tend to agree with that. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? Well, in fact, some scholars have gone further and they've said, actually, sovereignty is not really about the nation state in a sense, it's more about the individual and can the legal subject be protected wherever they might be. So I'm a British person living in Australia, residing in Berlin. Who do I want to exert some kind of meaningful legal sovereignty for me? Frankly, whoever I'm accessing my AI through. So that's a combination of Claude and Microsoft and the networks I'm using and other things. And so people have said, Mireille Hildebrand has talked about the ability of the rule of law to govern how machine-readable inferences, she said, this is a few years ago, are deployed over a population. The ability to control, whether that be a community or a nation or anything else, to control the destiny, as it were, of individuals using the network. Might seem a little vague. There's a nice version of that, which has been used by Chris Draper and Nikki Gillibrand. And they talk about informational sovereignty, and they talk about a quadripartite model where you think about the population, us, You think about the territory we happen to be on, in this case Germany. We think about the regulation and the recognition of borders of different types, wherever we might be. And the interesting thing about that, and the way they put it, is that it's about practical applicability. In other words, can you actually have an effect in Germany on the AI companies operating inside Germany? Germany's a kind of cheating example because it's 85 million people, it's a very powerful nation state, fourth, fifth, third, depending on which table you look at, in terms of its economic power and its political strategic position. But it's a really interesting question. And I've said that one of the things that's interesting about that, a lot of my previous work some people will know about, is not so much about a Brussels effect, where the European Union is trying to exert sovereignty over American companies in particular, but also Chinese companies. But it's also about the individual nations inside and communities inside. And when I'm sitting here in Berlin, I'm not, when I think about AI sovereignty, really thinking about necessarily German regulators, as I'm thinking about what are they doing in Dublin? What are the regulators in Ireland doing about the American companies that claim to be based in Ireland? And that has a huge influence on me here in Berlin. I may be inside a gigantic country with extremely strong regulatory traditions, but that actually is less meaningful than what people in Dublin's regulators are thinking about doing as the Irish regulator, which is at least equal in stature in legal terms with the German regulators when it comes to European sovereignty. So lots of really interesting questions about this, and again, there's some other literature I can reference about this stuff. Okay, this will be, well, that's the end of the theory, because this is Cory Doctorow, and all of you will know Cory's work. And Cory said, look, there isn't a risk of AI sovereignty problems. There isn't a risk of a Trump strike that would knock everybody out. Although he has said, look, if Trump wants to get into Greenland, which let's hope it's not about to happen, or Cuba for that matter, then he doesn't have to actually roll tanks in. He can just brick Denmark. He can shut down their ministries, he can shut down large firms, he can just tell people not to do things with Denmark anymore. He can shut down iPhones and Android devices. And in case you think this is far-fetched, bear in mind, Trump has done this to various United Nations rapporteurs, to the International Criminal Court. He's told Microsoft and Apple and other companies to stop cooperating with them. But Cory, being Cory, says this is digital sovereignty risk, that he could tell the tech companies to brick a country, but it's also digital sovereignty opportunity. You think, well, why? And by the way, here is when I think of bricking in Denmark, I always think of Lego. And whenever I think of Lego these days, I always think of Iranian propaganda Lego and the way that this has been enormously effective in ridiculing the United States. If you don't follow this, this is actually the CNN documentary where they actually interview the influencers who actually are making these Lego films. They are extraordinarily powerfully made films. And I mean, they're just the Lego animations that we've been used to for 20 years. But in this case, they've been weaponized against Trump on behalf of an awful murderous regime in Iran. I don't want to pretend that there's in any sense an equivalence here. All right. Here's what Cory says. Digital sovereignty risk, he thinks, is doing nothing. It's continuing in a world where your country's government and business and industries can be terminated by, he says, by Trump. I've titled the talk Post-Trump, because I want us all to be aware that there will be a world in 2 years or 4 years' time, which will equally not be a world in which we can remove these risks. So I don't want to focus on, it's too easy to focus on an individual personality. I want to focus on change in the way that we think about AI sovereignty. And look, Cory says, and many of you will know Cory's work, he says, look, the digital sovereignty opportunity is simply by pulling away from American products, American services, producing products that defend people from big tech and Trumpian kill switches, as he puts it. And he says that if you think you don't have to do anything or change anything, you're living in a dream world. You have to be ready for the fact that there will be changes to come. And that would be an interesting thing to see if countries do really adapt that. The country that has done that most clearly is, well, at least in terms of their discussion, is Brazil. But also, of course, China. but Brazil would be the country which is more aligned with the West. I'm not going to talk in detail about some of the things that have been happening, by the way, in digital policy, but really interesting things happening recently on European courts changing their attitude towards liability of AI companies, which we'll see going forwards. Coyote Systems is the one which is the famous recent case. I haven't really got time to go through it. Final thought on what Corey said. By the way, Corey, of course, was talking about Canada, where he's a citizen, and he said, look, if Trump was to cut off all American AI products access to Canadian markets tomorrow, nothing would happen. People just wouldn't be using AI tools, but it wouldn't fundamentally change AI systems yet. Maybe this is a very early period where we actually do have a little bit more independence than we would have in 5 years' time. But he suggests that actually, as things stand at the moment, there would be ways of getting away from the control of US companies. I think all of us know that year by year we become more and more enmeshed in international systems. Okay, so if there isn't really a digital sovereign AI race, and I'm skeptical about the extent to which there really is one, but I'm obviously very conscious of the fact that US government control of access to Anthropic is a really significant, maybe the most significant issue that we've had so far on these things. But if it is just a kind of policy hype debate at the moment, let's use the hype to do something useful. And so here's my takeaway in case I don't get to my last slide. Let's invest in open, interoperable European Union AI models, because we should have been doing that anyway. And the European Commission has always said we're doing it, but they haven't put real significant investment behind it. So that might be the way to do it, and there's a new handbook which I have a chapter in with Philip Hacker and others, Philip's hosting me outside Berlin, and we discussed some of those things in there. All right, so that's the conclusion of the talk. Let's talk about a couple of the details. AI sovereignty is also, in the literature, it's been discussed now for quite a long time. And for the last 10 years or so, people in political science have been talking about algorithmic governance, the power to steer behavior and outcomes and opportunities, and the ways that you might do that. And of course, I'm sympathetic to that because that goes with my co-regulatory theme that I used at my last Plamadiso talk, but also that I talked about for a long time. So I won't go through the detail of that, really nice article talking about it. In legal terms, of course, I think of this as them saying, oh, okay, so they're saying code is law. They're saying that you can use software code as a way of controlling the way in which people operate, and American companies can do that in Europe, but equally European governments can require that to be done for themselves. And we've talked about this in law for a long time. I see Volker's smiling because it's like, oh look, there's Lessig appearing, having been out of here for a while. Oh, and also the diction AIRE, which has got the various verbs to Altman, to Musk, to Hinton, to Marcus, and to Jan. All of which you might be familiar with from the debate that they've had, and to a lesser or greater extent, each of these is now involved in international relations and international diplomacy, which is an odd thing. And I make a reference there to an book that I wrote with Ian Brown 13 years ago now, talking about moving towards a more interoperable way of having a digital network, which is where I think we should go, really. Okay, so AI sovereignty, the ability to shape, control, and govern the AI systems that affect the people within a community or obviously a nation. And that's technical, and it's cultural, and it's legal, and it's political. So that's hopefully everybody in the audience here today. And the idea is that sovereignty will be being able to achieve these goals without undue dependence on external actors. Undue could mean anything, dependence could mean anything. We'll talk about what that might mean in reality, and I'll give the example of Australia towards the end. And so there we are. And by the way, of course, when we talk about undue influence from external actors, here is the internal research carried out by Instagram, famously a few years ago, that led to them recently losing a class action in the US. User experience of downward spiral in their mental health is exacerbated by our platform, said the researchers. And what did Mark Zuckerberg do about that? Okay, so, oh, this is me. Everyone knows me. That slide probably should come earlier. I've been really interested in these things for a long time. So I've been really interested in co-regulation. I've been interested in sovereignty in telecoms. And we know it's shared between different networks and different peoples. BEREC is the European regulator of networks. We have the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, probably less familiar even to the Europeans in the audience here, because that's the content regulators. Actually, it's typically broadcast regulators, but they now have responsibility for online content. And of course, we have a European AI office as well. No equivalent in the UK or Australia yet, necessarily. There's an AI safety institute in each country, but not quite the same thing. So we have this range of actors, or as it was put by Annalisa Volpato, the different voices in the choir. There isn't just like a single singer when it comes to regulation. There's a whole choir of agencies and actors involved. All right. I'll talk about some of the things that this affects. So, we've been able to observe the mainstreaming of a European discourse on digital sovereignty over time, and that's now become AI sovereignty. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Europe because we're sitting in Berlin, but also because European AI sovereignty has become like the biggest actor in town, I suppose, in many ways. And the policy model I'm thinking of here is something which some of you might recognize as the regulatory capitalism theoretical model. Ben Ferrand and Helena Carapico have said that the European Union is becoming, and here is a very old term for you, all of you are suddenly putting on your David Ricardo hat and thinking, I remember this from year one of economics undergraduate, regulatory mercantilists. Now, whether Europe wants to or doesn't want to, it's becoming a more mercantilist system when it comes to AI sovereignty and AI trade. And that's because its two biggest partners, first China, but now also the United States, are engaged in something which is far from free trade. If you believed in free trade in AI services, you would not be shutting down non-American access to Anthropic, or at least the latest Anthropic models. So we recognize that that's the approach that we're moving into. And this is the reimposition of digital borders. So remember this, because I'll say this again. Regulatory mercantilists are not the same as free market capitalists because we've moved to a new world. And I'll explain why that's happened as well. And by the way, I know quite a few people in the audience that have a background in telecoms. Telecoms policy has always understood this. We've never really been in a world of entirely free market trading, and we've had lots of different approaches. But the things that are now happening around the world are really quite different. So the US and China have their own approaches. The European Union is building something called the EuroStack to deal with its own AI development. India has its own AI stack, sometimes called the Bharat stack, the Indian stack. Brazil has AI sovereignty concepts as well. And we know that in the US there's lots of discussions about things that I've even seen called the AI Cold War idea of a battle with China. Okay. And there's a link to private law, which I won't talk about in a huge amount of depth, but I think for the economists in the room, it's important to remember that when you say where is the control exerted here, it's exerted in private contractual relationships between different companies, but also between governments and companies. And as someone recently said, I won't actually name check them because they haven't published the article yet, procurement is sovereignty. When the German government or the German health system or individual states are buying AI, if they're putting in requirements for data localization or for particular types of control over that AI, they're exerting actually sovereign control through their procurement contracts. I know procurement sounds really boring, and well, it is, but those contracts are how this happens. And it's really important to note. And there are huge investments taking place. I gave a valuation of SpaceX, which was a mistake because, of course, the SpaceX valuation changes have gone up quite a lot since then. And it's worth saying part of this, actually, in a more radical way, is the US president has been buying AI companies for the US government, or at least stakes in AI companies for the US government. Again, I'm not talking about the Trump-Musk relationship here, but he bought 10% of Intel, which is an extraordinary thing to do. And there's the spoof Governor Newsom tweet about that. All hail Chairman Trump. The Socialist Republic of America enters a bold new era of government-run business. It's an incredible thing to be buying stakes in strategic companies. There's been the repatriation of TikTok to Larry Ellison and Oracle and to other investors. There's now a discussion about buying 10% of OpenAI on behalf of the US government. There have been for a long time national security expert rules on AI chipsets. Year to year, NVIDIA's rules on what it can export, particularly to China, have been changing. And of course, we know about the Anthropic, Mythos, and Fable 5 changes. So maybe more to come. I got really interested in this last year. This is Christopher Millard, for those who don't know. Christopher runs the cloud computing project, the Microsoft cloud computing project at Queen Mary London, and he came to see me at Monash in Melbourne, and we talked a bit about this, and he talked about the fact that cloud computing has had sovereignty clauses built into it for really since the dawn of cloud computing, so for 20 years effectively. And if you'll forgive me, Volker, I'll do a very quick excursion into history. There are historical allusions to tech sovereignty that we can take on here. And sitting in Australia, we tend to look north to Indonesia, and we note the fact that the British, borrowing from the Dutch East India Company, provided sovereignty as a service to their clients, which they rapidly became the masters of, throughout the period from the beginning of the 17th century. And by the way, this is based on corporate law reforms that started in Italy, moved to Amsterdam, and then the British, as the British tend to do, and particularly the City of London does, it copies a good idea from somewhere else and then pushes it to the max. It's been said, by the way, that a lot of the model for the British Empire didn't just come from the Netherlands, but actually came from Venice, Venice was slave trading in Prague in the 8th century. I didn't know this. People who were not Christians in Central Europe were captured as slaves and sold. It was extraordinary. I mean, after all, this is the period just after the Roman Empire when slavery was everywhere. The British were, of course, the slaves of the Romans. Okay, and I should say, my university, Monash, has a particular interest in this kind of development. We have a base in Prato in Italy, where we look at the development of corporate law through the ages. I won't talk about this in detail to a more multidisciplinary audience, but I will say this slide might disappear in future years because Australia has finally joined Horizon Europe. We will be part of the European research space, together with Japan, of course, which has also joined this year. Okay, so sovereignty as a service, which is now what's sold by Amazon and Microsoft and others as part of their cloud computing offer, is actually an 18th century concept coming from the British and Dutch East India companies, and was actually, we almost offered sovereignty as a service to an entire continent in the 19th century. I'm not sure it was offered so much as imposed at the point of a gun, but nevertheless. And it's worth saying that this idea that sovereignty is intimately tied up to your trade relations is something which has never gone away for the more heavy metal parts of the economy, like mining, oil exploration. They've always had to have a strong relationship with the governments whose resources they're exploiting. Difference in AI is that what's the resource that they're exploiting? Computing power and us. And actually, I remember one of the models for the thing I'm discussing today, digital sovereignty, is actually the 3G network build out at the end of the 1990s and the extraordinary debates that took place between Europe and the US then. Okay, anyway, moving on very quickly. Digital platforms today are, of course, in this huge investment surge, like 19th century. It's the Infobahn, which is very much like the railways of the 19th century, the ferrovia of the 19th century. And I think that all of us recognize ourselves as being the consumer on the right-hand side here, with the horn stuck in our heads and being told AI features will be introduced to things. It's a really interesting period we're in. Who is regulating it at the moment? Well, it's being regulated really mainly. People think the AI Act is already in effect. It's not really in effect in Europe. We're really being regulated by existing laws, but really by ISO standards and by the big four accountancy firms who, as usual, are auditing what we're doing. So everyone's 42001ing and so on. Okay. So sovereignty as a service in AI terms is the $1 trillion, $10 trillion opportunity. It's an extraordinary idea. There is Microsoft sovereign cloud services, where they sell companies sovereign cloud. Amazon does the same. Amazon calls it sovereignty as a service, SaaS. And sovereignty as a service from Amazon included selling Australia $20 billion of federal cloud computing capacity in Australia. This was just last year. Anthropic Cloud has done the same thing for Australia in 2026. And people talk about, Amazon talks about sovereignty by design. You've all heard of privacy by design, sovereignty by design. Interesting, no? Okay. There is pushback against this in some places. Brazil, as always, is very interesting on these things. Luca Belli is always very, very interesting on these things. And Luca is on something called the Advisory Council of the Interministerial Committee for Digital Transformation of the President. And they are working on technological autonomy, self-determination, rights protection, and development concerns around AI. And I've got some links in there. I'll make the slides available afterwards, of course. So there are discussions. And even Silicon Valley was aware that their talk about a borderless world and the idea that AI could spread everywhere in the world without debate. This is not the case. There was a 1990s encryption debate, which some of us recall. 1993 actually was rather hard to export Microsoft Office programs to the rest of the world because they found themselves powerful enough to be caught up in non-updated arms control regimes. And so the Anthropic ban last week is not such a shock to those of us who remember. These things happened in the 90s. This is not so new. And I won't talk about individual elements of it, but this is not so new. Okay. Oxford colleagues, led on Berta, some of you will know very well, have talked about what they think infrastructure control might be here. And they say it's not just this Australian government idea of, it's not just having the data centers in your country and the data in your country. It has to be more than that. So it's not just how much AI compute you have or the nationality of the countries that own the AI compute centers. It's also who has the accelerator vendors control. And by the way, it isn't just NVIDIA, but obviously NVIDIA is a very important player there. They say that 9 leading cloud providers are 70% of the global market. 3 are actually more than half of the global market, one way or another. And they talk about the fact that obviously one of the issues is, if you think AI sovereignty is just about attracting data centers to your country, or say attracting through investor-friendly policies, but also through having local data storage requirements, that can't be the whole of it. And even if it was the whole of it, be careful what you wish for, because data centers obviously consume a lot of energy, a certain amount of water. I know the debate's very live about properly modeling that, but you need to think about the local socioeconomic factors. So Australia is very big with lots of spare land, but also a lot of heat and a lot of water. So every country will have its own equation for that. We need to talk quickly about the bubble. The bubble is, of course, enormous. The real bubble is the thing on the left. I don't trust a lot of the projections, but the thing on the left is actual spending by Meta and by Oracle and by Google and by Microsoft and by Amazon. Over a 10-year period, that is a vast increase in expenditure. Vast increase in expenditure. On the right is just some projections of where they think AI spending is compared to most internet spending. It doesn't really include local loops, so I wouldn't take it quite as, it's not quite as dramatic as it looks. But we are in a bubble. There, I've said it. We're in a bubble. And it's tied up to lots of the cross arrangements between these companies. I mentioned NVIDIA. NVIDIA has lots and lots of relationships with lots and lots of companies. This is a famous flowchart from from Bloomberg. It's worth saying this flowchart that some of you will have seen doesn't have Google or Meta or Apple or Amazon in it. This is just investments made by NVIDIA with other actors, particularly the Microsoft actors, but also with AMD and Oracle and others. So we are in an extraordinary business of cross investments. Okay, and we all know where we are now. I'm sure everyone's got a similar story. My university made a big investment in Copilot and in ChatGPT last year, and the students I was just teaching said, well, no, of course we only use Claude. So what can you do, right? You invest in the latest model, and by the time you've signed, and the ink is, I shouldn't say the ink is still wet on the contract, as if we somehow inked contracts these days, and suddenly the next model is more important than the model you just bought. So. Okay, here is a fantastic article which, if you want a kind of summary of why I ended up saying we moved into regulatory mercantilism, Abe Newman and Henry Farrell, wonderful article, The Weaponized World Economy, saying that things have changed in the last 10 years. There was a view that was taken by the US, which was not a free trade view, ever since Trump won and carrying on through the Biden administration. And that view was, I'll summarize it rather than going through the detail, we're not in a Washington consensus world of free trade anymore. We're in a world where we've moved beyond that and we've moved into strategic mercantilism. And it boils down to these things. Competition between the US and China is everything in a race, apparently, between the US and China. Europe is not in this discussion. Secondly, artificial general intelligence is right around the corner. Whoever first gets to artificial general intelligence is likely to win everything, not just the AI race, but the world race to be post-human. And the US advantage in that race is its chokehold over the chips, particularly NVIDIA's architectures, to train powerful AI. That was the view that was always taken up throughout the Biden administration. That view has been shaken a little bit by various different factors, not just the way that the Trump administration flip-flops on NVIDIA, but also the fact that China, it turns out, when it was denied access to NVIDIA chips, turned out to be very, very good at finding alternatives locally, but also at training smaller language models and smaller multimodal models. So this is a big deal. This was the Washington Mercantilist consensus until last year. And Farrell and Newman argue, look, one of the problems that's now happening is that because the Trump administration changes the rules very often, so NVIDIA couldn't sell and then they could sell to China, every administration is forced to build the plane as it flies. You don't form policy in a world of static parts. But this Trump administration is the first to pull random parts from the engine at 30,000 feet or 10,000 meters, where they're saying NVIDIA can and then can't trade with China. And they think this is a real issue. They think the US under the Biden administration thought it would respond to the age of what they're calling weaponized interdependence in AI in the way that it responded to nuclear proliferation. Right? Some kind of long-term strategy. They don't think that exists. It's all short-term deal-making. So we're in a different world in 2026. Really strange. And the UAE and others have been investing in US, well, particularly Trump administration, interests in order to get access to NVIDIA and other chipsets as well. The president last weekend flew his 747, the Qatar gift. So a lot of governments are trying to get involved in these things. And they think there's a lot going on where the US is spiraling, as they put it, into a rapid, uncontrollable drawdown of its assets. That this is kind of a closing sale for a lot of the way in which the US government operates. I won't go through much detail about the darkness they see in the future in the US. I'm not sure how true it is, and people in the States will know better than me, so I'm not going to emphasize the point. All right. What's that mean for Europe? Again, you're standing here in Berlin. The US decline in short-termism massively affects its relations with Europe. I was on Saturday on the Polish border. On the far border from Poland is Ukraine. On the far border from Ukraine, you can't get there because Russia has invaded that border. So we are in a very, very difficult world, and everyone in Europe is acutely conscious of the Trump administration's flip-flopping on Ukraine. But there is also, of course, a great interest in the way in which there is flip-flopping on other things to do with AI policy more directly. I should say, by the way, Ukraine's actually taking advantage of a lot of work with Palantir. I don't often say good things about Palantir, but Palantir is doing apparently some good things in Ukraine, helping to target Russian systems. Okay, this short-termism became really obvious very early on in the Trump 2 presidency. Vice President Vance insulted his hosts at the Paris AI Summit in February of 2025, and much more importantly, hugely insulting to the German Chancellor and indeed the German people when it came into Germany and went to Munich and gave a speech basically lauding the AfD before the elections in Germany last year. And for people in the States, that will never be forgotten in Germany, particularly not by anybody who is remotely to the left of the AfD in those elections. It didn't seem to have very much effect. I haven't put on this slide, but I am going to be in Budapest next week. Vance also turned up in Budapest campaigning for Viktor Orban. So these things matter. And they matter for AI sovereignty as much as they matter for other types of sovereignty as well. TikTok. Very briefly, the US banned TikTok's Chinese ownership. By the way, this happened throughout the Biden presidency as well. This started at the beginning of the Biden presidency, end of Trump 1. It's only finally come through now, because actually Trump did unconstitutionally delay the sale. Other allies have done the same thing. India banned TikTok in 2020. For those who don't know, China went to war with India in 2020. It was a small war, a localized war. It was enough for India to ban TikTok in India. So that was 1.5 billion people denied access. The Australian federal government denied TikTok access for civil servants in 2022, but didn't take action for anybody else until it decided to blow the whole stack by banning all under 16s from all social networks, including TikTok, which I'll talk about in a second. EuroStack, people know better than me, but Paul and Alexandra Gies and Francesca Bria and indeed Volkanen were speaking at a panel talking about the EuroStack. This is a good investment. It's a good investment in European AI capacity. It's a good investment whether or not we believe I'm going to call it almost a panic about AI sovereignty, because it's a good idea. And we've talked a lot about European indigenous AI sovereignty over the years. It's been a concern since the information society paradigm of 1994. There was a discussion for years about how we get the .eu global top-level domain. Huge issue that we had. That was one of the very early ones. I'm not going to get into domain name politics, that's a whole separate area. And a big concern during the net neutrality debates as well was about what we do for European capacity. Lots of discussion about it. So anyway, that's the stack. As you can see, it's a classic technology stack, beginning with critical resources and then going to chips and networks and cloud and software and AI. All right, so these are good ideas and would always have been good ideas. This is the famous Heisenberg Scott Marcus chart. By the way, this is, of course, a very small part of their chart. There's a lot of law. There was the CHIPS Act of 2023. There were lots of other things as well that were very important, including the AI Act and perhaps more importantly, Digital Markets Act. But it would be a great idea to make sure the EuroStack is as open and interoperable as possible. Europe leads, arguably, the world in open innovation. From the original World Wide Web design, obviously came out of Tim Berners-Lee working in Switzerland at the time, to things like the VLC player and the Videoland project, to Linux, I know these are not just European, but there are areas. Someone said to me, where are all of the European unicorns? And I said, Europe has a fantastic record in destroying private sector unicorns and ensuring gigantic public good investment. And it's not something to be sniffed at, right? The World Wide Web runs on Apache servers. What would be the cost of running the internet if everything was private sector? Tim Berners-Lee was famously told that he was an idiot because he didn't keep the patents to himself for the World Wide Web. And I said, why would I do that? This is for everybody. So there are good things that we do, and maybe we don't sell that as hard as we should do. And hey, if you're a European innovator and you want to make millions for yourself instead of contributing to the public good, see whether you can get one of those H-1B visas. Good luck. I mean, obviously it's a less attractive prospect now. Okay, and there were things that, oh, by the way, the things that missed out, I think I mentioned, sorry, this is a bit of a slow slide. Oh yeah, this is an article by my friend and former co-author, Stefan Verhulst, saying there are things that will threaten European the EuroStack, the idea of an open participatory mission-driven science stack, data, we need data commons, the Data Act and other things, Data Governance Act as well, will help us to achieve that. Some people talk about a data winter, the idea that we would have less access to data than we want. Information sharing, the ability to actually use some of the advanced AI. I think it is problematic. It's not an area I focus on, but it is problematic that a lot of dual-use AI is hidden behind, obviously, national security concerns of one type or another. I have no idea how seriously to take concerns about things like Palantir and indeed the AUKUS developments, because I don't know what's going on. And there will be people on this call who will, and will not be able to tell us because they'll be signing up to various NDAs. The agency that we have as Europeans, who sets the research agenda and why? How much are we able to ensure that European capacity is European capacity, as opposed to allowing some Australian to piggyback on it, for instance? Computation. More compute does not just necessarily create more impact. I know that people are modeling that here at the Weizenbaum as well as other places. It's not just build it and they will come, but strategic compute is important. And then, of course, there is skills asymmetry and thoughts about how much do we have people who are, as it were, bilinguals in technology and society, which is something that arguably Europe should be more effective at than people sitting in Silicon Valley being I don't want to use the word corrupted by tech bros, but I've just said it, so let's just move on. Okay. Oh, and I should say, wonderful person who, if you haven't heard of this person, first graduate of a European university to actually be sworn through, Elena Lucrezia Cornaro Piscopio. And she was a graduate of the University of Padua, but also she was a Venetian aristocrat. So admittedly, she didn't come from the social class that would necessarily be underrepresented. Okay. Oh, by the way, I put her up because, of course, DEI is something that we still take seriously in Europe, and it may well be that the world, for anyone who's from a minority or indeed from the female majority, might find the US a more hostile research environment at the moment than it was 2 years ago. Big changes. Okay, so there's some European policy literature about that. Paul can speak to the first one, which is the EuroStack, European Alternative Digital Sovereignty. Second article there, The European Way, by Kai Zenner and Robin Bergeron and Kefara and Hacker and others. And they talk about how we can achieve these things. Okay. And of course, bringing us right up to date, up until the middle of or the beginning of June, the European Union put out, the European Commission put out the Strengthening Europe's Tech Sovereignty paper. 4 real takeaways: new Chips Act, more investment, good. Although, of course, that's a long-term potential change. Cloud and AI Development Act, again, good. More cloud that's strategically placed is a good idea. Open source strategy, we've always had open source strategies in these areas. I like the fact there is more emphasis. I wish there was always more emphasis. I wish there was also more emphasis on this in procurement, even though that is a requirement to consider the open source alternative. And then also a strategic roadmap, which that used to be my old business around Europe. We did strategic roadmaps for the European Commission on everything. But it's always a good idea to find out whether you're mapping your data storage and data processing to your energy needs, particularly 2 borders away is Russia. So our former energy partner can actually get our Schroeder's back. Okay. Let me talk quickly about Australia, given that's where I'm from. You will enjoy the headline here. It's not going where you might think it's going. Australia's had lots of experience with not so much tech sovereignty as tech shared sovereignty, you might say. We've been active. We helped in the development of wireless LAN. We made a couple of very interesting decisions, including the National Broadband Network, which was a government-funded, government-owned fibre optic network, fibre to the premises, which turned out to be cheap compared to the costs of lots of AI deployments since then. And interestingly enough, it was very much delayed, but it just reached the majority of the urban population before the COVID lockdowns. Without that, Australia would still have been working with a very, very ramshackle, allegedly competitive, but effectively Telstra-dominated network. A lot of people now think that the National Broadband Network, in retrospect, turned out to have been a good idea. Very interesting, that policy discussion. We talked about the Amazon data center investment. Prime Minister Albanese went to Seattle to talk to not to Bezos, he was too busy, but went to speak to one of his underlings at Amazon and said Australian government strategic partnership with Amazon Web Services will deliver a sovereign top-secret cloud, which, those are the capitals they use, so I guess it's a TSC. Top-secret cloud is apparently a big deal, which will generate 2,000 jobs. I'm not quite sure why. Building the data centers, perhaps. And I've talked about these other big deals as well, left, right, and centre, including with OpenAI for schools, which Norway would say that's probably not a very good investment. You shouldn't be giving school kids lots of access to AI other than what they're getting at home, but that's a debate to be had. Okay. Australia is codependent and really an agent of the United States in these things. We do not have an ability to be independent of the US, and we don't pretend to, just as we don't have an ability in military terms because of the AUKUS alliance, which is our alliance with the United States, oddly enough, against our biggest trading partner, China. Difficult to explain that, but I can tell you later. The most important thing Australia has in the AI race is rare earth minerals. We have people, yes, but everyone has people. We have data centers, yes, but they have to be built. What do we contribute that the United States needs more than anything else? Rare earths. And that's what we provide. And that's our international leverage. In a way, that's the oldest story in Australian industrial development. Right? Melbourne, my city, was built on a gold rush. Welcome to the new gold rush. This is part of the AI's codependent shared sovereignty debate. We lean on our geography. The United States needs Australian rare earths. Weirdly, China is by far Australia's largest trading partner, but we have a creative tension with them because we've signed up to this submarine deal, which is also an AI deal, which is very much not in China's interest. And China has made it very clear that it is not happy that Australia is part of the AUKUS relationship. On the right, by the way, it turns out that the submarines are, those are American submarines, and the Australian submarines may be a few decades away. Okay. Final thing to say, because everyone wants me to say it, actually I'm going to say one thing about Britain before I finish. Look, it's not my fault that your under 16s are about to get banned from social media, but your under 16s are about to get banned from social media. And I don't just mean in Australia or the UK or Germany, but I mean across Europe and possibly across the United States as well. Why is it being done? We have a legacy of well-meaning paternalism. We also have a very strong Murdoch media in Australia, which is now being copied in other places. I don't know quite what it means, but I do know that even if it's a stupid idea, the fact that a government feels confident enough to impose it on American tech companies is actually, weirdly, an expression of AI sovereignty. Maybe a stupid explanation for AI sovereignty, but it's an explanation for AI sovereignty. Okay, I need to just talk about one thing, the British. And I've just got one slide on it, really. What's Britain's policy on AI? Follow the American money, keep some indigenous capacity where we can. So DeepMind, which of course is now owned by Google, but also the Turing Institute and other concentrations. London is by far the most important AI investment hub in Europe. London has more AI investment than the rest of Europe put together by some counts. Extraordinary, although a lot of that is, of course, fintech associated with the city. Nevertheless, London is enormously important. And always has been and always will be. The other thing is, I'm not sure what to tell you about British AI sovereignty leadership because it is Monday the 22nd of June, and we've had weaker policy leadership since Brexit, and particularly since formal Brexit, which was actually, believe it or not, was actually January 2021. I know we all think of 2016 when the referendum happened. This is our future Prime Minister. As of today, Keir Starmer has announced his resignation as leader of the Labour Party. This guy, who was the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, is about to be Prime Minister of Great Britain. I don't know what Andy thinks of AI. I can't tell you. We'll find out. Isn't life exciting? And that's pretty much it. Just to say, I love the picture more than anything else, and the picture completely distracts you from the message. If we are in a bubble, not just an AI investment bubble, but also an AI sovereignty bubble, let's use it usefully. So the combined impact of assertive national policies and indeed the regional policy of the European Union and global technological developments means that we need to take this seriously. And so let's use that political interest to fund things we should do anyway, which are European, interoperable, open source models to develop AI for the common good. That seems to me like an undeniably good thing to do. And if it takes a lot of concern, which is rightfully put in place, about AI sovereignty, let's ride that wave. Why not? Let's have an AI sovereignty tech investment bubble, which might end up replacing the private sector bubble that would otherwise be there next year. And there we are. Thank you, Volker. I hope I haven't taken too much time.